All right, we're recording. So thanks again for coming to Women Who Code Boston. So tonight we have 3 speakers. First up, we're going to have Jillian. She's going to be talking about evolving the concept of a customer. Second up, we're going to have Elisheba, who is going to be talking about form validation using Formik in React. And then finally, we'll have Chia, who is going to be talking about storytelling your way to an engaging technical presentation. And we'll be doing questions at the end, so you can put your reactions in the chat, but we'll be doing the questions at the end of each presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'd like to welcome Jillian. She's an analytics manager at Vistaprint, and really happy to have you here. Thanks, Jillian.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to attempt to share, so no judgment. Here it goes. All right, and presenting and switching. Good. Any thumbs up? All right. So as Shana introduced me, I am an analytics manager at Vistaprint. That means that my flavor of coding is a little bit more database than it is site, but I still feel very welcome in the community, and I'm really excited to give this talk. So thank you again for having me and for the opportunity. At Vistaprint, in the last 8 years where I've been there, I've held a couple different positions, all within the analytics community, both as being kind of an on-the-ground analyst to also being more of a product owner. The organization at Vistaprint is called Data and Analytics. So you'll see DNA, or you may hear me say DNA a couple times throughout the presentation. Vistaprint, I'll give a quick 101 on that on my next slide, and then we'll jump right into the content on evolving the concept of customer. So who are we? We don't expect you to know who Vistaprint is right off the top. We are a company that engages with small and micro business owners as well as consumers with their print and design needs. So if you get a brochure in the mail from the newest restaurant that is now offering delivery and takeout, we may have printed that for them. We may have helped them with their design. Those are the types of services that we offer. When it comes to design, this actually ties in very closely with customer. If you think about our customer journey at Vistaprint, we may expect if someone especially is designing that brochure, that they could potentially visit our site and engage over a couple different visits where they are in the process of putting this and potentially other products in their cart together. And the concept of being able to save those designs, come back, reference and order history was very critical to how Vistaprint's website was designed and how we thought about our customers and data. So it's really tied to this concept of design and how customers interact with the site and the site flow. So if we think about this from a data perspective, what did our quote unquote customer matrix look like? Everyone had accounts. So if someone were to ask, hey, how many customers XYZ, existed in January, year over year, we would have a pretty straightforward answer. We'd be able to say, hey, this many accounts. And the primary way in which we would think about these quote unquote customers in our database were, have they purchased with us? Have they not? And that was really the primary differentiator for us, in addition to a lot of other segmentations. For an analyst, this is great. This is pretty straightforward from a database perspective. Like a lot of the way that the table architecture is, you can have a primary key associated to an account, and this flows through in a lot of different tables across your database architecture. For the customer, it did mean that the site experience was maybe a bit more rigid, if you will. For instance, a very e-commerce standard option of guest checkout is not something that traditionally we were able to offer our customers. And from a data perspective, from a customer perspective, like we could do better. So this was, I said, the traditional way that we had of thinking about customer. Something happened almost a year ago that threw some of traditional out the window, the pandemic. So when we were thinking as a company about the pandemic, there were a couple different things that we wanted to offer. In our core site where we sell the majority of our products, we started thinking about updated designs. You see here, we actually started offering change the date cards instead of save the date cards. Like, love is still in the air, but it's just delayed. So we're trying to reach our audience in a slightly new way, fill the needs of the new market. In our other brand, Promotique, which sells products that are more like what you would see at a conference event table, right? Custom flashlights, USB sticks. We started focusing on key products like hand sanitizer, like branded hand sanitizer, right? And we did see this additional kind of gap in the market. And that was the ability to sell masks. When we talk about our code base at Vistaprint with the core site especially, we were not only kind of in the process of trying to replatform, but the integration of products within the old site can be a very complex task. So a decision was made to say, okay, as we're thinking about replatforming and as we're moving in this direction, can we use a slightly more like software as a service, microservice backbone and launch what we're calling like a microsite and think about this customer experience differently? And in those design discussions, there were a couple key questions that we had to ask in order to get to market as soon as possible and meet the need. One of those was, how do we handle accounts? Do we handle accounts? How do we handle design? Do we offer customization? And this was kind of a very interesting decision for Vistaprint out of the gate, which is kind of a company that defines itself by customization. We went to market with standard mask designs and customers were not yet able to customize. Now, that is, helping us meet the market sooner. That opens, again, a lot of other technical questions around if we don't have customization and people aren't saving their designs, do we need accounts? And if we don't need accounts, does that mean guest checkout? Does that mean, hey, like someone can sign up to receive email from us and not actually sign up to be a Vistaprint customer? And so all of these new experiences started launching. And while this is, customer-centric, meeting the market, a lot of really great check the box from like a technology and customer-centric perspective, it really did some very interesting things to our customer data. And so if we revisit very quickly this kind of more traditional matrix, and then we look to see what happened after we introduced things like guest checkout and email sign up, you see all of a sudden this expansion, right, of the types of quote unquote customers, like do we call them customers, that ended up in our database. We could be capturing individual pieces of customer information across a variety of means. And it could look kind of like this in this matrix. We could have had people who were opting in to receive email from us, but didn't have accounts, hadn't purchased, etc. This then becomes interesting also from a sequencing perspective, but let me put it in the context of an example first, so you can see like what this new customer journey might look like. And then I'll show a snapshot of like a fake database and kind of like what I mean by capturing all these different components of customer identity and how that looks different now. So this is Sasha. Sasha is in Ireland. They are visiting Vistaprint, and we assign them a visitor ID. We're like, hey, we think that this person is going to be visitor ID 222. Sasha is a cafe owner. She is looking to get some new brochures for her cafe. But when she enters Vistaprint, she sees masks and she's like, oh my goodness, like I'm going to navigate instead. I'm planning on visiting my parents. I'm going to be a really great kid and buy them some masks, buy myself some masks. So Sasha navigates to masks, ends up having a guest order ID. So still not a customer, technically, no account. But at this point, we can capture an email address. We can capture a record of an order associated to that email address. Then they're like, okay, no, like I actually need to start working on my business products, and I am going to register and actually create an account because I've started to design my new menus, and I'm halfway through, but I got to go, visit my parents, make sure they're okay during these trying times. So now all of a sudden, Sasha is logging in on a different locale, but with the same account, and they're placing an order associated to their account, which, if you notice, is using a different email, right? And then, they've placed their, initial business order, and they end up calling our customer service department, and they're like, hey, is there anything that I should know, given COVID times? Like, are there different delivery protocols? The people in my shop are gonna select or be outside to accept this delivery. And so all of a sudden now we also have a phone number on file that maybe we can tie to this order, which maybe we can tie to Sasha. And lastly, they're like, okay, when I registered on Vistaprint.com, I said, don't send me emails. But now I'm looking, on the website and, on the web, and I'm seeing, hey, when I walked around, when I was visiting my parents, I got inspired. I saw some, branded hand sanitizer, right? Like, where can I find that? I'm going to search. I'm going to end up on Promotique. Maybe I don't even really recognize that this is a Vistaprint, property, but I want to know more about what they have to say. I am going to sign up for their emails, but I'm not going to log in. I want to see what the deals are. So when we look at this slide, like, we can see that these are all activities that Sasha has taken. Sasha was going to, invest in masks, and then saved her designs, and then kind of moved into, investigating other products. When we look at this in data, it gets real fun. Because this is where we have to try to piece together the patchwork that is Sasha, right? And you can start to see how we might do it, but this is heavy lifting, right? You can start to tie together, hey, we got a site entry on visitor 222. This site visitor did an anonymous event and they entered this email. This visitor then ended up creating an account with this email, and then this email had an order, and then this order had a phone call, and then this email from up here also had an email sign up. So opt this profile of a person in and track this order to their order history, but not this one because this one was guest checkout. So handling this kind of identity management, right, all of a sudden is something that Vistaprint needs to develop as a core competency. Whereas before, all of these actions, most of these actions could be pretty easily tied to some type of account ID. Right? And so as we dig into like, how do we handle this? We have to think about things like identity graphs, householding. Householding is a very traditional term for anybody who's been in the print industry. What we tend to see is a list of addresses, right? And then you have to go through and you have to say, hey, like, I have this address, somebody spelled it S-T-R-E-E-T. This person is spelling it S-T period. Like, how do I smush those together? And does it actually like belong to two different accounts? So you can think about it as like the smushing, right? Of like, how do we take a lot of pieces of customer identifiable information, legally treat it the way that we need to treat it from a privacy perspective, and also try to leverage it from an insight perspective to understand customer behavior. And when you tie this type of information together, you do get the benefits of having a more personalized experience, being able to reduce your marketing spend because you're not targeting 2 different email addresses with potentially 2 different expensive advertisements. You can say, actually, these 2 email addresses are the same person, so I'm only going to spend once. So you get a lot of benefits, but you have to make a lot of decisions, because when you all of a sudden take one level of data and aggregate it up a level to a profile, like Sasha was navigating on the Ireland website and the UK website. So which country should we email them from? Which country should we associate to their account? When did they become a new customer? Like, do we count their guest order? Do we not? So these types of questions now we need to face together as not only an analytics team, but also as the tech teams that are feeding us this information and the data engineering teams that are helping us stitch it all together. So where do we net out? Like, where do we kind of go from here? We are trying at Vistaprint to move in a more customer-centric, direction always. This kind of accelerated that progression, if you will, so that we are trying to push towards more customer-centric experiences, but knowing that, in the shift of experience comes a shift in data. Like, typically you need to think about how any changes that we're making impact, whether it's site data tracking requirements, database tracking requirements, because once we have the data to explain the experiences, then we can start to tell the story about them, and that impacts the culture. And once you have the culture that is, more customer centric, you feed back in and can build more customer centric experiences, right? So it is kind of this cycle where we always need to be thinking, data first, even if that means customer first. So we are, again, in this transition. We are facing this challenge. At Vistaprint, we use like key results, OKRs, and if you're familiar with that language, and there are, some key results even this quarter around figuring out the ownership around specific pieces of customer data, the decision rights on at what level of profile do we aggregate customer data to, how this impacts segmentation, subscription data. So we are in the thick of it. And this is just kind of highlighting where some of that tension came from and how we are trying to face it ourselves. I know I kind of went through, but I was the first one, so I wanted to try to cut back on time if I could. But I'm happy to take questions either now or at the end, depending on where we at from a time perspective. And Shana, I'll leave that to you.
Thank you so much, Jillian. Yeah, if folks have questions, feel free to either unmute yourselves or you can put them in the Zoom chat.
And you can always find me on LinkedIn too and reach out afterwards if you think of something later on. I'll stop sharing. Chats. Question. Yes, data management is a core competency. Yes. Very much agree with that. And it is the partnership across tech teams that, need to be educated in how we think about databases and database architecture, and then data engineering and also analytics. All right. I don't see anything super specific, so I will jump off here if you, if there is one question.
There's one question. Yeah, feel free to unmute or just put it in the chat.
And you can always direct message me too. So, what is data mining? I'm curious about. Okay, so data mining really quick. There are so many pieces of data that we capture all the time. When we think about the questions that we want to answer with that data, we often need to go searching for it, right? Just like you would in, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, right? They all go mining for gems. So we all have to go mining, if you will, to try to find the pieces of information that help us understand a problem, help us answer a question. So theoretically, data mining is going into the database and seeking out information to tell a story, to find that nugget, right? The golden nugget of information that makes a difference in decision making, or providing insight to the business. Data mining can also be like text mining, where you're specifically using certain data science techniques to get specific pieces of information out of data sets. But theoretically, it's like finding the insights. Our particular database, right now, we are using Snowflake. We have used SQL in the past. We also sometimes use Databricks, which obviously can support multiple languages. 360 view of customer. 360 view of customer. This one, and this one is interesting these days, especially like if we think just generically about a 360-degree view of a customer in terms of how it integrates with privacy, in terms of GDPR, Schrems 2, and kind of the move towards the deprecation of cookies in the market. So these are all ways like cookies too are how we trace identity throughout the customer experience and throughout the internet in general. That's why you get a lot more messaging whenever you visit websites around, do you accept how they use cookies, right? For advertising and marketing purposes, yes or no. So the market is changing in a sense, and we are moving away from some of like the second party data that helps us understand the customer journey. And you may see in the market a shift towards people really relying on the data that they are capturing about individual customers in their database. And so this means having that handle on the pieces of identity that you are able to capture and house internally on your own systems. And so the 360 view, first, it's like getting the business on board to be thinking about customer, both from a strategy perspective holistically and also from a data perspective holistically, and then really investing in tracking appropriately in the kind of native environments where you're able to see the customer journey and then stitching it together. Shayna, I can take this one or take it offline and maybe reach out. I'm happy to do either. I just want to be aware of time.
If you have like a short version of tips for students that are interested in data analytics, and then
sure. I guess my number one would be to develop and cultivate a sense of curiosity and a willingness to kind of learn. And I say that, that's probably true for everybody, but with data especially, a lot of the tools and technologies are, even in their infancy, there is a lot that is changing. There is a lot that is growing right now. So read up, kind of be aware of some of those trends, some of those buzzwords, invest in, again, like that problem solving, analytical thinking, curious mindset, and then be coachable, like be open to learning new things, be open to the fact that the market is changing. Again, if there's kind of specific things that you're looking for in terms of like ways to dip your toe in, or different companies to maybe start learning to code. I know Maven Analytics is a good one that's local to Boston, offers some stuff. So you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn for more specific tips and tricks, and any other questions you have about starting an analytics. I myself was a communication and Spanish double major. So if I can code and be in the numbers, anyone can.
That's
I have a
awesome.
question for you, Jill.
Oh,
So I guess my question is, as you've changed your approach and understanding to collecting this customer data, during the pandemic, like, has there been enough time to see like if you're doing the right things, or if the process hasn't been perfect so far? I'm just curious to see like if you guys have changed your approach to this, during the pandemic.
I think one of the things that has changed in our approach because of the pandemic is, sometimes just being more on the side of speed. Because I think that there's a real kind of critical moment here where to be able to serve the needs of our customers so that like they do well, like we serve small micro business owners, right? So, if the pandemic hurts them, it can hurt us too. And we want to support them. So as I mentioned in this presentation, a lot of the decisions that were made, the trade-offs that were made, like could we have potentially sat down and all thought about how introducing guest checkout would impact the customer experience and deliberate? Like if I had my druthers, probably, would that mean that we probably missed some of the moment and kind of getting into market sooner? Probably. So I think it's also looking at speed, looking at being more flexible, looking at new opportunities, pulling things up in the backlog, thinking a little bit more outside the box, I think has been how we've entered into the pandemic. I think our CEO also talks about the difference between going on the offensive and offering new products, but also being defensive and thinking about how we still retain the customers that we've got. And not forgetting about those that have more traditional needs as we invest in new experiences. It's a balancing act.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Jillian, for joining us. This is really interesting and definitely a window into a world that I personally never get to explore much. So it's really, really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So our next speaker for the evening is Alicia Anderson. She's actually joining us from the DC metro area. She is a software engineer at Geocent, and she is going to be talking to us about forms in React. Welcome.
Thanks for the great introduction. Excited to give a talk for Women Who Code Boston. Thank you for having me. I'm gonna present here. So as I was practicing for this presentation, I was thinking, how many people are familiar with form validation or any of these technologies listed on the slide? All right, well, a few people, but I wanted to give some, I guess, high-level definitions of what they are. So those that aren't as familiar can follow along, as well as those that, work with them or have worked with them in the past. So YEP is a JavaScript schema builder for value parsing and validation. Formik is a small library that helps you with the three most annoying parts of building a form: getting values in and out of form state, validation and error messages, and form submission. So in the arena I work in DC, I work with federal contracting, and the biggest thing right now, or one of the biggest things, is modernizing different applications for agencies. And the particular agency that I'm modernizing for, we've had to make a lot of forms, a lot of modals, a lot of, I guess, form entry fields. So Formik has been a game changer in making that easier for us. And then, YEP, validating those fields has been amazing. And then in this particular application I work on now, Redux is a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. So there's a lot of state in the application I work on, and Redux just helps manage that state a lot easier. So there's a state within a component, but then there's also state that needs to be shared between different components. So story time. I had a story or Jira ticket where I needed to validate data coming to a text input component using what was in the Redux Store. So let's break that down for a little bit. So what is a component and what is Redux Store? So components in React, they allow you to split the UI into independent reusable pieces. Think about each piece in isolation. And then a Redux Store holds that whole state tree of your application. And the only way to change the state inside it is to dispatch an action to it. So let's see what that means. So this is a simple form. So in React, we think in components. So this first name, last name, email address, password. I could make a component called text input and basically just reuse that component, which is like a file, over and over again for these components right here. And then maybe I have a component for text sign up because I could reuse that over and over again in the app. And then I'd have a component button sign up and I could reuse that again anywhere in the app. So when you think of React Store, I try to think of a way to explain it a little bit better, but think of it as this kind of repository area and there's a store of data. And in my store, I defined it as people. So we have this array with the object and first name, last name, email as the keys, and then there's some data that's coming into that store that I added to the store through an action called add, and then I have an action called update and an action called delete. And I define all that in Redux. Don't worry too much about Redux at this moment, but know that there's some data that's in the store that I can grab, and then I have this form with that data fields. So one of the things I tried first was adding the store in a test within Yup, but that didn't work. So in validate this thing, I was trying to grab the state of the Redux into that function and then validate that the text that the user inputted was Erica. And if it's not that name, then it would display the first name is wrong. But that didn't work for me. I wasn't able to get that data from the Redux Store into the schema. So a user would enter first name here. I couldn't validate that there was any data in there. I couldn't validate that it was Erica. It just wouldn't come in to that area where I needed to validate. So I tried creating a custom hook. I thought, hey, I'll make a custom hook and then I can validate it that way. But that didn't work because I couldn't get the state from the Formic context into the Yup validation schema. So again, the same kind of problem. I got that dreaded error. Hooks can only be called inside the body of a function component. And when we look at the schema, I'm not putting it into a function component. I'm just defining it just as this object here. There's no function, there's no class. It's just this object thing here that Yup defines. So that didn't work. So thinking about Formic context, what is that within Formic? So when you think back to the form, you have the first name, last name, email, and the Formic context holds all those values that I entered into the form. That makes it easy. So it makes it easy for me to save and update the state. If you remember back to why Formic is so great for forms, it saves those values that you enter, and then you could retrieve them whenever you need to by calling the Formic context. So I couldn't get those values from the Formic context into Yup to then validate there. So what I end up doing is I added the validation to a function outside of all of these technologies, just in a React component, and I called it onSubmit. I created a new function that got the state, and it compared to a new value in the Formic context. I just grabbed the Formic context and the Redux Store state in that one component, made a function, and if it was valid, it would continue to process, get a success message. If it did not, I dispatched an error, and this worked. So to give a visual of what that looks like, I have an ES6 function right here. And on submit, we use TypeScript. So I just defined a type called Formic values, and that's my parameter coming in. It returns nothing. It's just doing some data manipulation. It's actually calling another function that's actually going to validate those values for me outside of this function. And then if that is all good, I return a promise, dispatch success, and if not, I catch and throw an error to the user. So that I just showed a complicated situation where I used Yep and Formik. When is it actually good for? So for me, I think it's super useful when I need to validate the Elisheba value, when I need to validate a type of value, when I need to test it against a value in the Formic context. You remember those little circles I had? If I need to validate the value in that Formic context with the value in that store, just need to equal it. It's good for that. And then we need to make a field required before submitting. So let's go through what these all mean. So thinking back to the form, we have the first name, last name, email address, password, and then sign up. Click it on submit. That's where I'm doing all the validation to make sure all these fields are good. So shape and type. So yep, I would go in and I would define the shape. So say I wanted to define it as an object. And within that object, I have a key, email, and name. And I'm saying email is supposed to be a string. If I put in numbers in that field, I want you to throw an error. And I could define that in this yep object. And then name, I want another yep object. And the shape is first and last. So the first name I want it to be string. If I want the last name to be string. If it's not, if you enter anything other than a string, I want you to say, you know, this is not the data I want. I can't click sign up. The sign up is going to be disabled in this situation. So things of that nature. And then validate a value in Formic context. So in this case, I'm actually just passing in the value that the user entered. So no need to use a Redux Store. And I can also just have a constant that I define that needs to equal Erica. And then I call those values in this function and make sure they're equal. And if they're not, I say this has to be Erica. And then this is just the name of the test, Erica. Required field, again, I have an object. And then I define the name. I want it to be string, and it's actually required. And then if you don't enter it, it'll pop up a message that says this is required. So all in all, I really like Formic and Yup. It really makes my life a lot easier. I can spin up a form really quickly. Whereas before you had to do a lot of manipulation. You had to do on change, on submit, you had to define these functions in your React component, but it's all wrapped into Formic magic, and it just does it all for you, which is great. And if you want to learn more about these technologies, this is the Formic docs, Yup docs, Redux docs, and then React getting started. They have all of these technologies have great tutorials, and you can piece them all together and make a nice little form, and then have a nice application. So are there any questions?
Thank you so much. That was great. Yeah, if people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourselves.
Let's see. Yep. I stuck on 6 months ago.
I put it in the chat, but validation is so super important to get clean customer data. So all the claps for clean customer data.
Yeah, definitely very helpful. Read on them, exactly how dirty it is. Yes. All right. Everyone shares my pain. No questions. So sounds like a good time. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. That was really great. I'm excited to start playing around with those myself. All right. So thank you again, Elisheba, for your talk. For our third and final talk of the evening, we're joined by Chia Lee, and Chia is a senior research scientist at Motorola Solutions, and she is going to be talking to us about technical presentations. So very meta presentation about presentations. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, do you see my screen? Cool. So, well, thanks again to Jillian and Elisheba for the fantastic talks. I must say they're really great examples of what I'm going to talk about here. So storytelling your way to an engaging technical presentation. I would start off by saying a bit about myself. I started off in academia before transitioning to industry, currently in an R&D role at Motorola Solutions. So for me, through the years, I have had plenty of experience with technical presentations, both as a presenter as well as a listener. And so I have definitely seen and given a gamut of varying qualities of presentations. And what really intrigued me is it really made me think like what makes a good and engaging technical presentation. So I'm sure we are all familiar with giving presentations at some point in our work. But what is a technical presentation? Is it just about presenting technical details? And I would say, well, not entirely. I think a technical presentation should be more than just about the details. I think it's a better way to view it as technical storytelling. That is that we want to deliver a technical narrative. So the question is, what is a narrative in the first place? You can probably Google what is a narrative, and you might come up with a definition such as this. A narrative is the choice of which events to relate and in what order to relate them. And what does this mean? So I would give an example. When I first conceived of this talk, my niece was 5 years old. Now she's older. But if you have nieces, nephews, children, and you ask them, oh, how's your day in school? Or tell me about your trip to the zoo. Okay, they'll say something like this. Mom and Dad and I arrived at the zoo at 9 o'clock. We waited in line for 5 minutes to buy tickets. Then we entered the zoo and we first went to see the tigers, and so on and so forth. Very chronological, very devoid of a narrative. Now, that was a story about a trip to a zoo, but in the case of a technical narrative, we want to be able to not just relate technical details in a dry, chronological, step-by-step manner. We want to be able to narrate a choice of technical content to present and cleverly choose the order to present them in. So a technical narrative is about what, when, and how to bring key technical details to the fore. Where can we use narratives in technical presentations? I would say we can use them anywhere. You can use them in a conference or seminar talk. You can use them in project reports for your manager, which we probably have to do pretty often. You can use them in code reviews, all hands meetings. It can be long presentations, might benefit from a narrative. A short update might benefit from a narrative, and basically any scenario where technical information has to be conveyed. And I would also say that a technical narrative doesn't have to be shallow or flippant or non-serious or definitely not fictionist. It does not have to be fancy or Pulitzer Prize worthy, but it has to be able to guide the listener to conceptualize the information that you're trying to convey. So there's basically no excuse to develop a narrative in any of your technical presentations. So I would start with an example. Let's say a very potentially dry topic like literature review of topic X, let's say. Typically might start off with a basic introduction, but now we want to say, oh, how does topic X infiltrate into your life? We might talk about that, and then move on to maybe start off with author A, starting in with some historical context, 1980s. This was the seminal paper, and it was way ahead of its time. Now, moving forward 20 years, we have author B in 2012 that wrote a breakthrough paper that revived author A's method. And he did that by using a really ingenious idea. Before we can go on to other topics or other papers in this literature review, we have to step back to understand the technological advancements that enabled author B's breakthrough. And once we have done talking about that, we can talk about further developments in the field that came in 2016, where author C and D did a clever tweak of author B's approach to push a state of the art. But there are still some caveats. It's still not perfect. And so on and so forth. So future directions where the possibilities are vast and the challenges are equally great. Now, this could be an outline of a narrative for a literature review. And we will dissect some of the narrative elements in here. You would notice that there is some element of anticipation of what to expect in the presentation. There's some elements of conflict, tension, and resolution in the topics that are being presented. The elements of emotional investment. How does topic X affect your life? And there's also elements of the presenter being opinionated in the way that he presents the content. So before I move on, if anyone wants to take a stab at what topic X is, I have something in mind, but if you want to guess, you can type that in the chat, but I will not say what it is. Okay. So let's talk a bit more detail about the elements of an effective narrative. So one very important element, I think, is the element of anticipation and expectation. This is the ability to anticipate what your listener is expecting to hear next, and then to address that directly, whether it's in a positive or in a negative. So for example, you might think that we should try to increase our computing resources, but in fact, it's better to streamline our algorithms. Or a natural next step is to add these data features to our machine learning model. Or we usually do, I know you expect us to be requiring the same version of a package, but in this case, we have to make the code compatible with older versions, for example. Another element of effective narrative is the building of conflict, tension, and then taking it to a resolution. So for example, it's widely accepted that this would work, but our experiments suggest it's entirely not true. Clearly that raises a contradiction. Or this issue might have implications later on, so watch out for that. And maybe we failed to speed up the UI performance, but we fixed it by refactoring the code, let's say. So conflict, tension, and finally a resolution. Third element on my list is emotional investment and appeal to the listener. So imagine how customers would react to this change. Haven't you wondered why we could never get this product to work? And what would you do in this case? A simple question to get the listener to be invested in the problem, the challenge, as well as the solution. And finally, I think this is maybe sometimes overlooked. I think an important element of an effective technical narrative is to be opinionated, of course, politely. For example, this method is ingenious, or that update is the key driving factor. Maybe it's a hack, but it works. Yay, right? And it's important to be opinionated because your opinions would guide the listener's viewpoint. The listener is expecting to hear what you think about a certain topic or a certain technical issue. Politely opinionated. Okay, so so maybe literature review is kind of like, I don't know, kind of really out there. Like not many people do literature reviews all the time, but if we have to give updates to our manager frequently, we might have to do code reviews frequently. So I came up with another example for a code review narrative, and we can step through it and start to identify the various elements of an effective narrative in a very simple code review. So for example, we start off, we had to do something about the code because implementation was so very inefficient. And we found out it was due to a duplicate code. This creates tension. It's creating conflict and tension. And you might think that the obvious next step is to eliminate the duplicate code. Now I'm anticipating what you as a listener is expecting. But now I have to address it. But we found a more robust way to refactor the code using two main changes. So I'm addressing the listener's expectations and providing a resolution. And also by using adjectives such as more robust, that expresses a very important opinion in a polite way. And that gives context to why you took this approach. So we took these two changes, standardizing the data format or reorganizing the code in classes. Okay, I made up this example, so it's completely fictitious. But okay, so at this point in time, this is where perhaps it's suitable to start talking about the actual details. So we say, okay, first let's discuss the data standardization. We define in this header file. We added these lines to these functions in these C++ files here to convert the output, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. And then we talk about the second point that we promised. Now with standardized data, it becomes easy to reorganize the code into classes. And again, easy expresses an opinion. And again, it gives support to why you took this specific approach. And so yeah, created parent classes, child classes, move this here, move this there, and so on and so forth. Now, imagine how much your code reviewer would get up from your presentation if you just pulled up your VS Code or whichever editor you use and just went through the code line by line without any narrative. That would have been pretty hard to follow. So I would also say that I'm sure many of you already naturally use narratives in your presentation. And if you do, kudos to you. It's worth recognizing the elements that you're actually employing and keep it up. And now that I have talked about some of the elements of an effective technical narrative, you might be wondering, effective for what? What motivates when, how, and which of these elements to employ? So to be able to understand, to answer this question, what really we should do is to go back to the starting point of every presentation and ask the most basic question. So what is the point of the presentation? So it's the point of your presentation to update your manager on every single thing you did last week. Your manager probably needs updating, but the real point is to put your work in context to help your manager perform his or her duties. And this would involve, say, anticipating what your manager expects to get out from the presentation, to contextualize and maybe summarize information about what you did, including opinions, polite opinions where appropriate, and to provide details only to assist in illustrating these concepts. Or maybe you're giving a seminar presentation, and the point of it, would it be to relay every piece of information connected to the seminar topic? Well, you might do better to change your viewpoint and to think of it as guiding your listeners to conceptualize information and understand the significance of what you're trying to present. Perhaps you might use conflict and resolution to bring out the key parts of your work, the significant parts of your work. And you might also use more like emotional investment to engage the listener's attention. And the last example, what is the point? Is the point of a presentation to give an organized presentation? Not entirely. I mean, organization is essential, but it should not override the purpose of telling a story with your presentation. Okay, so this is my last slide. So what's the point of this presentation that I'm presenting right now? It's not to give a presentation about how to give a presentation. It is to give you some sort of foundation and way of thinking for you to go explore your own narrative styles. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. Really, really helpful. If folks want to put any questions for Chia in the chat, it looks like there's some reactions here.
I can't figure out how to get to the chat. Oh, up here. Okay. Where's the chat? I'm going to exit this presentation. Stop share. Okay, here it is. Cool.
Lots of good feedback.
I guess I've got a quick question. I said in the chat a little bit earlier that there are parallels to how you would want to tell stories with data, like you're presenting results to the business. When you talk about like, you know, coming with an opinion, right? Like that's so critical when you're telling a narrative story. When you're telling a story with data, we think about it like, I guess, a little bit differently because we're trying to be like super unbiased, right? Like even if we didn't like the experience that we tested, if it won, like you have to still communicate that it was successful. And so we tend to talk about it in terms of like giving that recommendation, like coming to the end and kind of having that like unbiased recommendation. And it's an interesting balance, I think, between like opinion and recommendation. Do you see more technical presentations focusing on like the opinion and coming away with like a point of view and a perspective? Is it also like a balance with like recommendations for you guys too? I know for us, it's a little bit of a line that we have to tread.
Yeah, I think that definitely there is some sort of trade-off, but perhaps you might think of opinionated not necessarily as being unreasonably opinionated, but to know like, oh, you know, this is a good model, and the model may say 50% probability. The model itself may not be opinionated, but I may be opinionated that the model is a good model that we built, right?
Agreed. Although the model probably thinks it's also pretty good.
Yeah. And of course, it's definitely opinions can be wrong. I would say do not be afraid to be wrong. And though, of course, definitely always acknowledge that, you know, if I have had so many times I had the wrong opinion, but you know, I come to terms with it.
Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you so much to all three of our presenters this evening. This was so much fun. I think everyone really learned a lot. Lots of great reactions and feedback in the chat. I'm going to stop recording now.